Hi, I'm IKEA, and for today's video, I want to start a new series called Toolbox, where we'll go into building a toolbox in this first one, and then also augmenting that toolbox in future videos where we'll go into specific styles or even specific builds, and just discuss some of the tools that I feel you should have in your toolbox. In this primer for this series, we'll actually go back and kind of redo the Improving Yourself series, pulling the points from that one and then discussing them here in this primer. And then later on, we'll go into specific builds. So yeah, let's go get started. And to lay out what I mean with tools and toolboxes and such as, otherwise it's just buzzwords, of course. Tools are basically any tactics, strategies, or even just simple actions that you can take to improve outcomes. Now, you'll even build a real-life toolbox to deal with situations in real life or at your job in different ways. And even in a literal sense, like a toolbox, if you just have a hammer and some scissors in your toolbox and nothing else, when you need to go and drill a hole in a wall, yeah, you don't have the tools for that. Same is true basically in video games and actually real life as well. But for instance, in video games, a lot of people struggle, or specifically the Division, in running full red builds. This is not due to the build, this is due to the toolbox that the player has, because the player matters kind of just as much as the build. That's why also in build showcases and such, I go out of my way to kind of show gameplay, but also not just show gameplay, but in there try to teach what I'm doing or why I'm doing some of the things that I'm doing. Those would be basically that. Tools that you can use, and that's usually how I bring it as well with build showcases, is to give you the tools to run the build if you choose to make it. And these are then specifically videos in these where we'll go over, in this one for instance, the 6 tenets that we kind of put out in the Improving Yourselves series, where we went over 6 specific things that I feel are pretty important places to improve yourself. Here we'll kind of give tips on some of those, and then yeah, in future videos when we go into, for instance, a red toolbox or an Eclipse toolbox or a Turbo toolbox or such, we'll go over basically a lot of things that I feel will improve your outcomes with those builds. Because as we're going to lay that in the It's Not the Build Dummy video, it isn't the build. A good player, even with a bad build, can perform well. Bad player, even with the best builds, might not perform well at all. And the analogy I often use for this is cars. And we can see the player as a driver, the car as the build, and then whatever the content that we're running as the circuit or the city or whatever we're driving on, basically. And the build matters together with the content because, for instance, yeah, if you take an F1 car and try to go rallying with it, it's gonna have a bad time, independent kind of the driver a little bit. But even there, a good driver might be able to actually get that F1 car to the end of the rally instead of crashing at the first tree. But the driver is a very important component there, because if you put Granny in an F1 car, she's just gonna spin out. But if you take a competent driver and put them even in a bad car, they will perform still well, independent of, for instance, what circuit they're on. But they won't be, for instance, be able to beat an equally competent player with just a better build / car on that same circuit. At least that shouldn't be the case, because if they're equally competent, then, likely then you could see as that person being better, because all 3 matter. And here especially we're going to focus on the player to build up a toolbox there that you can take into everywhere. As this is also quite often the thing that, as well, descent is a good indicator of this, I feel. A lot of players that struggle in early descent, they just lack the toolbox that would be needed. And that same toolbox can actually be useful for the rest of the game, even though it is somewhat specific, for instance, to descent. But yeah, let's go get started by reiterating actually the 6 tenets that we laid out in the Improving Yourself series. And we'll start with the first one we discussed in the Improving Yourself series as well, which is positioning. So where do we place ourselves physically and how do we get there? So for instance, here we come to Lincoln as a good place to show off what positioning kind of can mean. So a lot of people, for instance, would set up down there, all the way down there. Instead, I'm going to rush forward And here, for instance, is one of the tools within positioning, as these are basically going to be the compartments, and then we put tools into them. But one of the important tools in positioning, for instance, is using tall cover and peeking out and just exposing yourself to a minimal amount of enemies. So for instance, here I'm setting myself up just so I can be hit by at most 1 or 2 enemies. I'm not exposing myself to everyone, because if I set myself up where I can shoot everybody, everybody can shoot me. That is one of the core tools that positioning, for instance, will have. And then the next step is triage. Now, triage is a term that, normally gets used for other things, but it can fit this as well, where triage is basically what action do we take first. So for instance, here, one thing I can do is just hit that instead of, for instance, hitting an enemy first. I tried going for the backpack on that enemy as well to kind of use that to crowd control them, to CC them. And here as well, I'll, for instance, again, go for that backpack and try to CC some enemies as well. Now, for instance, if a medic comes out like that, I will prioritize him, because if we leave that guy for too long, he's going to create a bad time for us. Here we'll have a heavy come out, and what I'll try to do with this heavy is try to get his backpack off. So triage to me as well is even going, do I go for the weak point or do I not? We'll take care of this guy as he's kind of trying to sneak around. And triage is, just what actions you take, and that can even include falling back. So basically the order you're going to engage things in. And you can kind of make that already in your head, go about it to try to what you're going to do when you're looking at the engagement. So there was a foam guy here, they were close to a barrel. I'm going to blow up the barrel, I'm going to go for the foam guy. Just setting those actions already kind of in your head, putting an order of operations basically in your head, makes it executing it a lot easier and much more consistent. So that is then a very important tool within triage, is just to basically in your head kind of vocalize, okay, I'm going to go shoot that guy, then that guy, then that guy. If you need to change because, the situation kind of changed, then that's fine. But at least you have a plan. Even if it doesn't survive combat, at least you went in with a plan. Then let's go to awareness. So awareness is basically just trying to keep track of what is happening around you when wave spawns and such. So for instance here, I kind of know this content pretty well. I've done Lincoln a time or twice. So I know, for instance, now there is going to be a spawn back there already going. So by the time that I kill this guy, there's already some other guys ready here. And of course we get all the heavies. But here again, we're going to go for that backpack, try to, and we do get it. And try to get that going. Now here, the next wave already has spawned, and I'm going to use, for instance, a tool here specifically for awareness. So while I don't know where everybody is, or didn't, when I pulse and actually just use a skill for awareness, while of course that skill could also be something offensive, could be something defensive, here I'm using it specifically for my awareness. And having awareness, so for instance here as well, I know now that the next wave has spawned, so we have another heavy in the field because the boss here is a heavy, and I'm kind of too far away to consistently hit them. But awareness, just keeping an awareness of the battlefield, basically where enemies are, just so you can make actions by that. So for instance here, I lost awareness of this guy. Luckily I got saved by my health gate there, because otherwise they would have finished me off there. So keeping awareness is very important, because otherwise the lack of awareness almost cost me. Now, of course, things like fog of war can cost you awareness a little bit, and you can make up for that with the pulse, for instance. But trying to have and keep awareness is very important. And this even goes to, for instance, if you're playing a healer, now you're not trying to keep awareness of enemies, you're trying to keep awareness of allies. And next up we'll have aim. Aim by itself is also including basically the understanding of the accuracy and such of your weapon as well. So for instance here I am using an LMG. This thing isn't that accurate, being a Pesti on a build that doesn't have too much weapon handling either. But I still know that I can, for instance, blind fire when it's that kind of distances and get decent results. Not at these kind of distances, but at the distances if this guy closes the range, yeah, then quite easily I can. But also just improving aim is a very important thing to do. And you can, of course, yeah, use the game, for instance, and run headhunter builds without determined, for instance, to kind of improve that. Or even out-of-game tools and running aim trainers. As that is a pretty good way to improve your aim just by using those, as they help train basically the muscle memory required there. Because here, especially for actual aim, having the ability to snap from one place to another and back and such is actually a tool set that you build for yourself, or a tool that you build for yourself. And that actually carries, of course, around through basically every game that you play, at least as long as they're shooters, basically. And yeah, next up is build knowledge. And build knowledge is actually understanding your tools that you create with your build. So for instance, here I'm running the Pesti build, the Langmo setup. And with this build, I have a few tools that this creates for me. So for instance, we have the Pestilence. This will go around, and once I get stacks going, this will usually kill an enemy or two, even some that are out of sight for me. So I can actually focus, for instance, on enemies that aren't Pesti ticking away, as if the Pesti tick, if I already have a full 50 stack Pesti tick on, let's say, a purple, they're going to die from that. There's no reason for me to kind of prioritize them, especially if they're already not in my field of view, for instance. And when I'm playing the room with positioning, they're maybe not already there, then yeah, I can just leave them. I don't need to prioritize them. But then, for instance, with a striker, we have much more direct damage, and then we can focus more on that and just killing quicker on one single target. And of course, the build that I pick already provides a few tools. So if I'm going to be running an, let's say, turret drone hybrid, I'm gaining some tools there, but I'm giving up, for instance, a little bit of my main damage, which is also one of my tools, of course. And that is an important thing to know, what builds create for you. This also then includes skills, as we kind of discussed. Yeah, for instance, a pulse is a really good tool for awareness, but then something like smart cover can add to our damage. Something like a decoy can take away damage coming towards us, basically. And knowing what the skills can do and what they can provide for you, for instance, as well, a shield or a blinder firefly or an EMP jammer for if there are warhounds and mini tanks around, or even an EMP sticky for the same purpose. All of those things can be really powerful tools that you need to understand and situationally think to yourself, would this be better than this for this current situation? And that is, yeah, that is, you create tools with your build. And that's also, for instance, when we go into Descent and starting out, we don't really have a build going. You're kind of left to your own devices. You're basically left with a main weapon and a pistol, maybe, and just basically no build underlying it with minor skills to help you out. And that really reduces it to its base components. And now you have to just rely on your, for instance, positioning and aim and such, because we can generate a lot of tools with the build. And lastly, but definitely not leastly, is game knowledge. Now, this encapsulates a lot of things. So for instance, spawn points, knowing where things are going to spawn. For instance, in Lincoln, I kind of know all of the spawns by heart at this point. And even know that, for instance, with some of the spawns, you can kind of cheese it a little bit by facing in a certain direction and making them spawn. But that is something completely different than, for instance, if we go to a master mission. So the builds that I would, for instance, also take into an heroic missions is different than if I'm doing a solo master, but that's also different than when I'm doing a group master. Same, for instance, for the raids, of course, as they kind of require their own thing, or if I'm just doing open world. So for instance, if I am hitting IV tunnel, that's, yeah, the choices that I'll make there and the positioning and such is different than, for instance, in a mission where we kind of know where everything's going to be at all times. Control points can be a little bit more chaotic, let's say, especially if something joins the fight, like a convoy or something. Knowing those things, and over time you will build up that knowledge just by playing the game. You'll build up, okay, If I go to this control point, these seem to be the spawn points. If I go to this one, it's this one. When I engage enemies, for instance, in West End, which I roam around a lot, I'll basically know all of the spawn points here. And then usually there's, for instance, here, there's 2 spawn points, 3 actually, for instance, where they can spawn for this one. And knowing those kind of things can make a lot of difference. But then also what is kind of required there, as of course, for instance, for legendary missions, I quite often say that it is very important actually in there to know what is going to happen before it happens, because those are very consistent. The player still matters, the build still matters, but actually knowing it there is a much more important thing than if I'm just doing a heroic mission, even if I'm not familiar with it, for instance, with some of the new ones from Brooklyn. When we first started doing them, of course, they were new to all of us. So when we start doing them, they're kind of still fine on heroic. You can get by without knowing perfectly where everything's going to be, because you can just overpower it. In legendary, that part is kind of taken away from you. You can't per se overpower the enemy. You can to a degree, but not to the same degree that you can on heroic. So now suddenly it matters a lot more to understand where things are going to happen, what's going to spawn where, and that is just knowledge that you can actually learn, and also from, for instance, videos going through some guides for legendaries specifically, and foaming guides, for instance, and from that knowing what is going to happen before it happens. And knowing those kind of things is a very important tool as well in the toolbox. And let's kind of show that in action by just taking 2 different builds and kind of showing how that changes the tools that I have, for instance. So here we're still on that Pesti build that I showed a second ago, the Lengma one. We're going to go do Fallen Cranes, and Fallen Cranes as a control point. Here I'm going to take actually a very different route than I'm going to take in a second with with a Heartbreaker Techtank. This being a glass build, I want to have some distance. Now here as well, one of the simplest tools in positioning is actually to use stall cover, but not use actually the cover system. Because when I pull out here, I'm much more exposed than I am actually just like this. So I'm going to pulse, getting my awareness of where everybody is, and also see that there is something behind there also fighting. So they might get caught up in this, but also I see that there is nobody coming down the streets here. So I'm free to engage. I'm going to go for this shield guy first, where I can quite easily get a 50 stack going. They'll likely be dead at that point. Once I have 50 stacks on an enemy, they will actually likely die to that. Especially on a build like this. That's kind of the point of a build like this. So even that shield guy, I can quite easily deal with him. But here I'm just exposing myself to 1 or 2 enemies. That is the core of positioning. And I hear something coming. I'm just gonna make sure I get it, even though I aimed a little bit too early there. Gonna pulse again, re-get my awareness. And then, for instance, here as well, the game knowledge lets me know that, for instance, at night, especially at mid and longer ranges, enemies struggle a little bit more with just shooting at you. And then here, I'm just creeping just out enough just to get shots out. And then I'm using the tools provided by the build, the Pesti tick basically, to kind of get some kills continuously going. Pulsing again, just to get awareness again. And then here, for instance, I'm not per se taking too much thought to triage. I should have killed that medic, for instance, before they got this person up, but they'll die again in a second anyway. My aim doesn't need to be perfect here. I'm kind of set up pretty far away, so I'm not going to expect the most of it. And now as well, again, that Pesti tick is just going to kill that guy. I don't even need to expose myself if I don't want to. So we have some tools coming from the build. For instance, that Pesti tick helping out. But then, the rest of it, positioning, knowing how to position, knowing how to, what target priority we kind of take with triage kind of matters quite a bit. Let's see it now, for instance, with a different build where we're going to have quite different priorities. And here we'll come at it from a different side and also, of course, get a convoy on top with a different build, giving me different tools. So the build gives me some tools, but then also I need to have some tools to go with this build. So for instance, on this build, I can be a lot more aggressive. That's what the tech tanks are kind of built for. But also I shouldn't, for instance, sit back and try to just shoot from far away, because that's not going to work out too well for me, because I'm using a TKB, for instance, here. With a Pesti, at least we can, at range, kind of have a decent outcome with it. This weapon, not so much. I want to be close, and then also being close is kind of an important part of the tool set of this build. Because being closer, I can actually go, for instance, for more headshots. I can try to hit more weak points where, you know, with the Pesti, we weren't per se going for that, really, because it just wouldn't have been effective to do so. But also here I have my shield to kind of use as a tool to kind of keep me alive and close. There it gets healed back up again. And yeah, we're dealing with even more than we were doing so with the Pesti, which is a full convoy on top. Because, of course, the game just quickly spawns one in, the game knows. So yeah, we'll have to deal with those guys and gals as well. And those kind of things as well. There, I went for the weak point here. I'll try to go for the weak point again and kind of fail, though, on that one. But going for weak points is, for instance, a thing that people kind of quite often forget. Oh, we have an elite patrol joining as well. Let's take the weak point there. That even got somebody else. Because, for instance, on those RC ladies as well, that'll take away their ability to put out RC cars. So, quite useful. I'm gonna start closing the distance. We have a lot of mementos there, for instance, to grab. And then let's go deal with this heavy. We'll chain him. While he's fixing his chain, he is no issue at all. Awareness-wise, I'm in front of a minigun, and somebody was going that way, so keep watch out for that. But yeah, basically this heavy is a non-issue to a degree that I'm just going to ignore him and go for her. And just finish that one off, and then we can come back. Chain him once more. Go over the helmet. And finish basically as much as we can without there being an elite convoy on top of this. This was about as messy as it can get. But then we have a build that can deal and have the tools to deal with that. Together with that, trying to keep awareness, trying to have decent aim, trying to have triage going, and yeah, going for some of the weak points, knowing when to push, knowing when to pull, because you may have noticed I kind of kept my position there, mostly because this was positioning-wise really great, where I can just deal with a few enemies without being exposed to everybody, of course. And those tools is things that we need to cultivate in more people, I feel, and that's kind of what this series is going to be all about. Most of them will go much more intricately, as we'll go into things like, yeah, discussing health gates, positioning, and such, even in more depth for specific builds, and also things like door boundaries, for instance, for specialized builds that kind of require some understanding of that, for instance, foam eclipses and such. But yeah, let's go and conclude this video for now, as that then brings us to the end of this first primer into the Toolbox series. As yeah, in this one, we kind of kept it very broad, as yeah, I kind of need everybody to know these concepts, as we'll be using those terms and those terminologies going forward. In future ones, we're going to go a little bit more specific, pushing into, for instance, yeah, just red builds, or even red glass builds, or fire eclipse builds, and things like that, or drone builds, and kind of narrowing it down. And in doing so, we can kind of have a deeper discussion about what is kind of needed as tools for those, as we'll go, yeah, into things like the health gate, things like door boundaries, things like just keeping an eye on your skills and what skills can do what and such. And I hope that will be useful to people out there to improve their gameplay and kind of build themselves up to the point where, yeah, they can have a pretty broad toolbox to bring to any situation. Yeah, so if you did enjoy this one, I hope to catch you in those. But also, if you did enjoy this one, please do any and all of the algorithm things down below, as that does help out. So I'll do that little bit of shilling here. For future videos, we're actually going to go into that expose, as I kind of discussed in the last two. I've been holding it off for a second, as I've been meaning to get to a certain point with some of the legal side of things. And once that reaches that point, because I want to include that in that video as well. And also, yeah, we'll go into future videos of this, although likely in a few videos away, we'll have the next one in this series. But this will be a series, and yeah, we'll start adding and adding to it as we go along. So yeah, thank you all for joining me. And as always, have a good night.